Nintendo profits crash. Next-gen console battle begins. And arcades go 3D. These stories and many more on this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, the show where we travel back in time to find out what was making headlines in the home computer and video game industries of yesteryear. I'm your host, Carl, and I'm joined again by everybody's favorite co-host, Alex.
Welcome. Happy to be here. Oh, I jumped on you. Happy to be here.
Not a problem. So, before we can turn on the time machine and head back 30 years to October of 1993, it's time for obligatory podcast banter. What have you been up to?
Well, getting very, very hungry, because before this obligatory podcast banter, Carl and I went on a much longer pre-podcast obligatory banter, reminiscing about Christmas markets. Well, for me, it was reminiscing. For Carl, it was like Tuesday. But
and
yeah,
Wednesday and Monday.
Yeah. Right. So getting hungry, Carl, that's what it is. Other than that, just getting ready for the holidays, which are fast approaching at time of this recording.
That's right. We're recording this on the 21st of December. This will probably come out sometime between the holidays, or maybe even get postponed depending on when I can actually get another interview episode cut. Tell you, moving to video has been a pain in my butt, but hopefully people will enjoy it. So, but yeah, too many interviews. Okay, but that's a good segue, because remember, everybody, we have interviews and they go up early on the Patreon. So if you like what we're doing here, for $1, you can get early access to them. And whoever hasn't watched it already, our commentary track for the 1993 video game violence hearings is also online. Did not release that as audio just because it does not make any sense as audio. But if you go to the Patreon page, you can link directly to it on YouTube. No patronage necessary. So everything is available except, of course, it'll be available eventually, except, of course, for the video version of our next segment, the 7 Minutes in Heaven, where our intrepid co-host must play a game that was reviewed in a publication dated October of 1993 that they have never played before for 7 minutes. And we had some wonderful contenders today, games that have left a mark on history that many will recognize, like Burn Time, or Battle Cars, or Super Shinobi 3, or Stronghold. And yes, I'm choosing all the ones that are kind of lesser known because that's kind of fun. All of them would have been good choices. Of course, there was also, Star Wars for the Game Gear, or Samurai Showdown, but I'm pretty sure you played that one.
Yes.
Minor technicalities. Curse of the Catacombs? I don't think you played that.
No, I haven't played that one.
Oh, yeah. See, there you go. Could have had that, but instead you went with my suggestion this time, which was
always a mistake.
Yeah, DMA Designs classic Hired Guns on the Amiga. So, are you ready?
Sure, I had to throw you a bone, Carl. You're always talking about that Amiga, and I'm always playing SNES and Genesis games. So this one's for you, Carl. It's a Christmas present from me to you.
I could have made you play Burn Time. That would have been even funnier to watch. So, with no further ado, let's get to some Hired Guns. Welcome back, Alex, from your 7 Minutes in Heaven. So, for the uninitiated, how would you describe Hired Guns based on your 7 minutes with the game?
That's a great question, Carl. I wish I had an answer to it. But to be a little less flippant, as near as I could tell, it is a multiplayer game, no doubt better with multiple people, in which you are accomplishing missions with a squad of 4 with different skills and abilities. In first person, you have to go around finding the things to get to the places, to complete the objectives, to, triumph over something, I guess. Aliens or something. I don't know. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, well, if you go into the plot, it's something along the lines of a bunch of human mercenaries have been warped over to this alien planet, and they're being sent on these weird missions. There's a plot, but it doesn't really matter. And, yeah, no. But yeah, so it's basically it's a 4-window version of Eye of the Beholder without you being able to move the whole party at once like you would in Dungeon Master or Eye of the Beholder.
Yeah.
And
that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, this game does get a port to the PC, although the PC version lacks a little bit because it's harder to, at that point in time at least, to get joysticks, joypads, and so forth connected. An Amiga can have 2 mice running at the same time, and the real joy of this game wasn't what you had, which was the single player version, but it was actually having 4 players around the same machine on a 12-inch monitor yelling at each other of, why aren't you over here? Or, where's the guy with the explosives? Why aren't the explosives in the right place at the right time? And everybody else trying to jump out of the way. And yeah.
So what you're saying is it was the prototype for Overcooked.
Basically, this game, I didn't get to play it too often with all 4 players, but the few times I did, the only game that was more hectic than that was Space Team. Sorry. So it reminded me a lot of Space Team. Have you ever played that?
I have not.
I cannot recommend it enough. A very simplistic game. You have to be on the same Wi-Fi, but you really need to be in the same room. The idea is that each round, each player gets a different set of weird knobs and buttons that look similar to what you'd expect from old school Star Trek. Some of them are knobs, some of them are buttons, some of them are levers, and there's this little scroll at the top of each person's screen saying, flip the Mudgubanabi this time. And you may have that controller, but you may also not have it. Maybe it's somebody else's, and you don't know which other player has it. So people start yelling at each other. Flip the Mudgubanabi. And the whole time you see the progress of the ship, your starship, being chased by asteroids or something. And you have to get the ship across, and the longer it takes to do whatever command needs to be done, the more damage the ship takes. Suddenly you'll have panels hanging off, and you're trying to twist and turn the screen to get them on, and everybody's yelling at each other. When you have 5 people playing this at the same time, they're yelling over each other, trying to get the stuff done right. Absolutely entertaining. And that's what Hired Guns felt like in 1993, with everybody like, somebody get to the exit, and where's the cover fire? And why are you shooting in the wrong direction? And it's absolute brilliant chaos.
I can imagine. I can see that.
Yeah. It's the kind of anarchic madness that you expect from DMA Design, the people who also gave us Lemmings.
And Grand Theft Auto.
And, Grand Theft Auto is still coming. Right now, the prototype of the game is in development, Cops and Robbers.
Yep.
And they also released this month Walker. Those are the last 2 games for the Amiga. And Walker also has a weird two-player mode that can get very chaotic, where one person is on the joystick moving the walker left and right, the other person is controlling the aiming reticule and shooting enemies. So while you have the one guy trying to move forward to crush people with the walker's feet, the other guy is like, why are you moving? Now I don't have my aim. And you're just trying to coordinate this. It's a very entertaining experience. But, so, so looking at the game from your point of view, your experience, would you recommend this title to people today?
Well, I certainly don't think anyone should play it as a single-player game. I mean, that kind of step-based motion of your dungeon masters and your Eyes of the Beholder is pretty clunky these days, and it doesn't really have much to recommend in that department. However, you've sold me. If you can get a group of 4 friends together and cluster them around a monitor and yell at each other, sounds like that would be a pretty fun time.
It is. There was an attempt to do a remake using the Unreal Engine around 97, 98. I actually, my website at the time, the AmiCrypt, we had the first screenshots were leaked to us by one of the developers. Oh, wow. And I had them on the site back then. And then there were also a few more shots appeared in Next Generation magazine a couple months later. So they had it running. It was going to be both over network play, but it was also going to support split screen. But the game just died in development hell. It never went anywhere after that, unfortunately. So, Hired Guns, a concept for multiplayer couch that should return, but I don't know if there's anything equivalent to it on the market today, sadly.
Indeed.
Oh well. Okay, then we have one more task to complete before we can turn on the time machine, and that is to check in with our good friend Ethan to find out what we got wrong in our, what comes before October? Oh yes, September of 1993 jump. In a little segment we call the Department of Corrections.
Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from
the Department of Corrections.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring. To accept charges, press 1. You may start the conversation now.
Welcome back, Ethan. So, what did we get wrong? Or what did I get wrong?
Carl, why don't you ever say welcome forward?
Welcome forward?
Instead of welcome back.
Well, welcome back to the show. I welcome you forward.
We're welcoming forward the new year, Carl. It's about that time.
Yeah, that's true, too. I mean, we're still stuck in October episodes, but we're recording in December. You have a valid point. Welcome forward.
There we go.
To the edge of the cliff. No.
Now, that's where you are, Carl. Here in the Department of Corrections for September 1993.
Oh, my goodness. There's probably so much to cover. Hit me. Hit me. Hit me.
Of course, the joke is that there isn't. All right, first we have the Alex comment, which is actually a correction this time. So I'm just splitting up the Department of Corrections here. So, Alex, Camerica never actually released the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. They went bankrupt before they released it. There are units that are out there because a warehouse was discovered full of them.
Aha!
You can watch Norm's video to get the full skinny on that. But yeah, the Aladdin Deck Enhancer was never sold at retail.
Now, in Norm's video, he talks about no evidence of it ever being listed for sale through any retailers or so forth, through ads. Do we have any inside dope on this? Has anybody interviewed anybody at Camerica to confirm that?
I do not believe so. There has been interest in Camerica, of course, in regards to the Game Genie stuff. And sometime this year, I believe Dilly Dillon was attempting to track down some stuff on Camerica and came up pretty short on that. Not his fault, just there was nothing to find. Maybe eventually one day we'll get a little more information. But we know at the time they went bankrupt. And I forget if that was in that video or one of the later videos Norm did, but the Canadian government foreclosed on them because they rerouted their 1-800 number through Cuba.
Wow.
Yeah.
Was there a specific tax reason they were doing that, or?
I got no idea, man. This is weird stuff, and it's all in Canada, so who even knows?
Oh, that is messed up. Oh, well. So they go out and somebody who basically did the corporate equivalent of buying a storage locker made sure that the world got their Aladdins.
Yeah. Quite late, of course, as well. 1993.
Yeah.
And now for the one thing on the Department of Corrections for Carl. I'm not even going to make an attempt to feed the sadomasochism fetish that we have going on in the Department of Corrections here. It's actually Barkley's Shut Up and Jam.
And I probably said shut up and jump, didn't I?
I think you did.
Yeah, okay. Shut up and jam.
Which, funnily enough, there's been a re-release. I forget which company did this, but they did not have the rights to Charles Barkley, so it's just called Shut Up and Jam. And they changed the face of Charles Barkley on the title screen to some random stock photo guy, and it looks so bad, so very bad.
No, I don't have to look at it to know that you're speaking the truth.
So that's it for the Department of Corrections in September 1993. Carl, you get off easy this time, but I got these tickets here, and you will sign all of these tickets. This is like German bureaucracy in the Department of Corrections.
Oh my God, it can't be that bad. Say it's not so.
We'll have to see next time. See you then, Carl.
Okay. As always, sir, thank you for your service.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, light month this month, but it is worth taking a moment to talk about the Camerica Aladdin Deck Enhancer thing. First of all, if you haven't watched Norm's video, the Video Game Historian, about all of this, do it, because it's great, like all of his work. It's possible, and this is what Norm says too, this isn't like original to me, it's possible that it was released in very small quantities, but after Ethan pointed this out, I did do my own search through the newspapers, as I believe Norm did at the time too, and concur with him that there are no ads for it. It was certainly supposed to be their product, and it certainly got out in the wild eventually, even though it might not have been Camerica that released it. And I still think that, to my understanding, is the failure of it, whether it was a failure to sell well because it was released or a failure to release the darn thing at all, still did play a role in Camerica's demise. So that larger point still stands, though Norm also goes into some of the other nuances about that. But yes, it is very likely that Camerica did not actually get the bloody thing released.
Yeah, and I think that whatever that twilight zone is of was it released or not, the larger story that trying to release an add-on for the NES this late in the game was a bad idea, period. And throwing a bunch of 8-bit Codemaster ports from European home computers on there was not going to improve the situation any.
That's right.
Okay, cool. So that resolves that issue. Let's turn on the time machine and head back to October of 1993.
The best possible game.
1993. System.
Kid could point a gun at a television set.
Welcome back to October of 1993. Alex, what's our first story?
Well, it's certainly not about 8-bit Nintendo add-ons, because JAMA Show brings the tech.
The Japanese arcade industry has shown off its latest wares at the JAMA Show. Sega introduced an activator-based Dragon Ball fighting game, a 3D Star Wars game, and of course their own entry into the textured 3D driving game arena with Daytona from their AM2 studio, and the on-rail shooter using Sega's sprite scaling Alien 3 The Gun. Namco's expanding its 3D offerings with Cyber Sled.
The future is here, Carl.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be talking about a lot more 3D games in the arcades. These were just some of the highlights from JAMA. And we will be talking about the activator some more later on as well. But yeah, the idea of doing simple sprite-based stuff in the arcades, well, it's still going to be a big deal, as we'll see with fighting games for a while, but the era of 3D is upon us.
And you know what that means, Carl, don't you?
What?
It means Ridge Racer debuts. Remember that one?
Yes, I do. And I am not going to play in the crickets here. But I probably will spend some time with Galaxian. So, or was it Galaga? I always get that mixed up.
It was Galaxian. It was Galaxian.
Yes. Because I know Ethan's corrected me on that once before. But so Namco has introduced Ridge Racer, a 3D racing game that takes the fast action of virtual racing and one-ups it with textures.
Yes, this was kind of the height of the intense competition between Sega and Namco. I mean, they were always competitive, but once Virtual Racing came out, there was a race, between the two companies to see who could get texture mapped stuff out there first, whether Namco could get theirs out or Sega could get Daytona out. And of course, Ridge Racer won that particular battle, though I think it's fair to say that Daytona won the war.
Oh, definitely. I mean, as far as mind share in the arcades, I mean, you'll still find Daytona cabs to this day, OG Daytona cabs that are still getting plenty of play. And I've never actually seen a Ridge Racer cab in my life.
Yeah, I don't think I have either, or at least if I did, I mean, I never played driving games much in the arcade, so if I did, I just didn't pay attention, but definitely couldn't miss the Daytona cabs all lined up in a row.
No, you couldn't.
Mid to late 1990s arcade.
No, I mean, they just took on a life of their own. At Funplex, I think we had 6 of them lined up right as you walked in. I mean, they were the first thing that you saw. And they were not always completely filled, but yeah, there was constant play on those things.
Absolutely. But even though Namco is first with the texture-mapped racing game, Sega is going to take another first here, as Sega takes fighting 3D.
Sega has taken their 3D tech from Virtual Racer and applied it to 3D models of humans. The result, Virtua Fighter, adds new depth to the tried and true sprite-based fighting game mechanic.
This is easily one of the most consequential games in the entire history of video games. It literally changed the course of history, and it's not so much about the game, which was insanely popular in Japan, of course, but it's because during this period of time, Sony was beginning to shop around its PlayStation to third-party developers, which they were desperately going to need because Sony did not have a robust first-party development apparatus. And everyone just kept saying to them, no, it'll never work. You'll never get the price where it needs to be. We're far away from this being possible. And then Virtua Fighter released. And even though it was a coin-op game, that was the game that led the entire Japanese industry to decide, okay, maybe these Sony people aren't as crazy as we thought they were about what they can do in the home. And this was the turning point in them starting to get massive buy-in from third parties for the system.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, once you showed that you were going to be able to create characters out of these polygons, I still remember, and I've told the story on the show before, but it bears repeating. I was living in Germany at the time. Could not get into arcades because there were also gambling machines, so you had to be 18, and I wasn't 18 yet. But I remember I was it was just a weekend trip, a Saturday trip with some friends to Hamburg. We were going there to hit, the video and music shops to pick up new stuff. And we were at a train station. I remember going down an escalator. And as we're going down, there's a window that looked into one of these gambling dens. And they had Virtua Fighter. And I could see it. And I'm looking at 3D characters just in the attract mode, jumping around, camera moving around them. And I immediately said, we have to go back up. And I had to go back up. And we're going down this escalator again just so I can look at this thing. And I realized in that moment that, and I'd been talking to friends about this for years, that if you could move enough polygons, you could make characters look real. And I think there had maybe been a preview someplace or an image or two of Alone in the Dark. But that was still clearly using pre-rendered backgrounds at fixed camera. Just seeing that in motion changed everything. I mean, I played games like Hunter on the Amiga. I played Midwinter. I knew that you could do characters, but they were basically just blocks. It didn't feel real. And the motion on Virtua Fighter cannot be overstated how revolutionary that felt. They felt realistic in a way that even Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat didn't feel realistic because of the limited number of animation frames. So
exactly. Yeah, it literally changed everything. I walked through the red light district of Hamburg once.
I'm not going to say whether or not I have as well, but I have. Yes.
Though my version of that was very boring because it was the middle of the day. I was there on my own for just an overnight, and my hotel was out in the suburbs. And I was like, I'll just walk it. It was about 2 miles, but it was fine. And as I'm walking, I'm like, oh, this is the red light district. I could have taken the S-Bahn, but so the most I did was take a stop for a Diet Coke. Actually, it's probably a regular Coke, not a Diet Coke, at a McDonald's in the red light district on my way through. Everything was closed up because it was still the afternoon. But I was like, oh, wow, this is a big red light district.
All I have to say is I was not there during the day.
All righty. Moving on to a few more Sega technological wonders, Sega teams up with W Industries.
Sega has teamed up with W Industries of Leicester, UK, makers of the Virtuality arcade hardware. Their strategic partnership.
It's Leicester. It's Leicester, Carl. You got to take syllables out of those British place names.
This is true. Damn French influence. I'll blame it on the French. Their strategic partnership will bring VR to Sega's arcade offerings. Now, this apparently, as far as I can tell, goes nowhere. But,
yeah.
In light of the fact that Sega has already announced the Sega VR system, and Sega has also announced that they're going into bigger amusement park style arcade operations, this does make sense at the time.
Oh, yeah. No, that's exactly where it's coming from, because this was the period of time when Hayao Nakayama was really trying to transform Sega into the new Disney. I mean, that was his stated aim. And a video game style amusement park, Joyopolis and all that stuff was very much part of that. And you needed to have more advanced technology. You had to have video games that almost felt like rides. And so they were doing elaborate motion simulator games, and they were exploring virtual reality games because they were trying to create the amusement park of the future.
Yeah, and we'll talk about it a little bit later when we talk about the premiere issue of Edge magazine. But one of the striking photos that they have in there when they're talking about this whole movement is a picture of a Sega Center that has like 5 360s in a row and an equal number of virtual racing sit-down cabs in a row. Mm-hmm. So, pretty crazy stuff.
Absolutely. And speaking of some craziness, Williams sues Capcom.
Williams has sued Capcom after Capcom hired 2 of Williams's employees away and, according to Williams, got them to divulge trade secrets to help Capcom break into the pinball biz.
Yes, not many people, I think, are aware of Capcom's very brief flirtation with pinball. But there was this weird period here where pinball was making this gigantic comeback. Of course, in 1992, you got the Addams Family machine, which remains the best-selling flipper pinball of all time. And so Mike Stroll, who had back in the early 80s been the president of Williams, came to Capcom, and in the words of one person I interviewed, not about this, but just mentioning it on the side, convinced Capcom to get into the pinball business, and said it was something of a derisive laugh because it was a horrible idea. And so then, of course, he did poach some Williams people because that was his old stomping grounds back in the day.
Yeah, and Capcom is also teaming up with Romstar, who's also sort of not in the best of health at this point. And they start a company called GameStar, which, when it finally launches in 95, will be renamed, I believe, Capcom Coin-Op something or other. We'll talk about it when we get to it. But yeah, they're only in the business for less than a year. And only released 4 pinball games in 1 year, which is kind of insane when you think about it. But, yeah. This is happening.
The whole thing was insane, that is for sure. And helped lead to some real problems at Capcom, though it was not the primary thing leading to those problems. But not a good time to be trying to break into new areas of coin-op, because we're just about, even though it looks like things are getting better with Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat and whatnot, we're just about at the end in a lot of ways, as is certainly signified as a 7-Eleven's coin-op exodus continues.
Yes, we talked last month about 7-Eleven's decision to exit the coin-op biz, citing the increased violence of games. This month, more clarity is coming out as the parent company's new majority shareholder, Southland Japan, which owns 7-Eleven's Japanese operations, had rescued 7-Eleven in a bankruptcy proceeding after the company had undergone years of losses in 1991. Some operators speculate that the new Japanese owners are using their Operation Rescue initiative, that's the name of it, which will help franchises remodel stores, which also requires them to, amongst other things, remove coin-op, as a ploy to get rid of American games and operators and replace them in a year or two with Japanese machines.
We got to get our tinfoil hats out for this one, Carl.
Okay, this is another theme that we've talked about several times in these years. And we've talked about it in general. I mean, coin-op operators tend to be, as far as I can tell from the letters pages of these magazines, a bit on the conservative side. We saw it when they were talking about the LA riots. We've seen it when they talk about gambling on Indian reservations. They're definitely, when we talk about the Japanese. And so this idea that, the Japanese now own 7-Eleven because the 7-Eleven convenience store chain in Japan is huge. And the American operations have really fallen into a bit of disarray in the last few years, end of the 80s. They've lost a bunch of stores. They went into other areas like auto repair parts and stuff like this. It's just, they went into a bunch of businesses they had no business being in. And so hundreds of millions of dollars have come in from Japan to rescue 7-Eleven. And they're offering, to help the franchisees remodel the stores, give them a new look. And they want to get rid of, the devices that just cause people to loiter in the stores and so on and so forth. And I mean, you might interpret this veiled jab at, Japanese games, because let's face it, the game that everybody's worried about with the violence is Mortal Kombat. We have Time Killers is also, I believe, out at this point or about to be released. Was it Time Killers? That other arcade game with the cartoony violence?
I think.
Is it Time Killers so. Or... I think it's Time Killers. Yeah, Time Killers. And this is another one that's causing a lot of uproar. But these are both American-made games. American-designed games coming from American publishers. And there is an argument to be made here that they're trying to say, oh, they're just going to bring in some Japanese machines. We've also had in the last year the controversy about Capcom getting into operations, handing out the turbo add-ons and the turbo Street Fighter turbos to their people as opposed to the independent operators first. So I think that the operators are really feeling that there's a conspiracy behind behind all of this, which is absolute nonsense. I mean, it's just Southland trying to make sure that the mothership, so to speak, doesn't collapse. So you're right. Tinfoil hat time. But it is interesting to see the mindset of American coin-op operators at this point in time in regards to this very important for them development, because losing the 7-Eleven is huge for a lot of them.
Yeah, and it's emblematic of the times as well, which we will talk about right now in a little more detail with our next headline, Nintendo reduces profit outlook.
Nintendo has announced the first expected drop in their profitability in a decade. Their forecast profit of 170 million yen, 170 billion yen, $1.6 billion, has been dropped to a forecasted 121 billion yen, $1.15 billion, which is 26% lower than the previous year for the fiscal year ending in March. Revenue has also dropped dramatically. The previous forecast was for 600 billion, 5.6 billion yen in revenue, and that forecast is now down to 500 billion, so $4.76 billion, 11% lower than the previous year. The extremely high yen and increased competition in Europe and the USA from Sega have hit the company harder than many who bought into its image as an unstoppable enslaver of children would have expected. Nintendo expects exports to make up 59% of their sales in the first half of the year and only 42% in the second half. And the total yen value of exports will fall by an estimated 22%. Nintendo had also kept its core workforce at just 890 employees, despite massive increases in its output relying heavily on outsourcing. Nintendo had also set the exchange rate for its predictions at 114 yen to the dollar at the beginning of the fiscal year, but now it has fallen to a low of 105 yen to the dollar, and Nintendo has adjusted its currency rate to 107 for the year. And I should just say here real quick, those profit numbers are pre-tax profit numbers. This is very important. The Japanese are reporting pre-tax numbers, not after-tax numbers here.
Interesting. But yeah, so this kind of cuts to the heart of the whole trade issue between the United States and Japan, which the video game industry is now getting caught up in. So it's worth kind of delving into that just a little bit. Back in the 1970s and early 1980s, as the Japanese were regaining an international foothold in industry, they started flooding the U.S. market with cheap products. They came first in steel, then they came in cars, then they came in electronics. And there were widespread allegations that the Japanese were dumping, by which we mean that they were illegally charging less for their products overseas than they were charging at home, charging in order to suppress competition in other markets. And I think at points there were even rulings by international trade bodies that they were in fact engaged in dumping, which, I believe so. So this was a huge scandal, and the Reagan administration, of course, inherited this whole mess, and they started taking heavy protectionist measures against Japan, most famously in 1987, even going up to a 100% tariff for a while on Japanese goods. This is part of what the coin-op industry is responding to as well, this tinfoil hat idea that the Japanese keep using underhanded trade practices in order to push American competition out of the U.S., out of their own market. And of course, the Japanese market is so closed that they can't crack it to try to reverse that and do it in the other direction. So as part of all of this, in 1984, Reagan's government and the Japanese came to an agreement to strengthen the yen over time as a compromise where they would strengthen the yen and then the Americans would lower their tariffs, because the idea is that if the yen strengthens, Japanese products will be more expensive than they are now, and that may take care of this competition problem that America saw. So what's happening right now has its seeds back in 1984, literally. Now, by this time, the yen has strengthened so much because of these deliberate methods over the past decade to get the yen stronger, that it is really starting to hurt companies that rely on exports for a lot of their profits. Japanese companies that rely on exports. And Nintendo is one of these, and Sega is especially one of these. Sega's going to end up getting their clock cleaned over this. Nintendo not quite as bad because they do have the strong domestic market as well. But basically, they are losing lots of money in currency exchanges because you just don't get the same amount of yen for your dollars anymore as the yen gets stronger. Of course, this is beyond our ambit here, but this is also going to wreak havoc on the real estate market because the Japanese had been taking advantage of cheap yen to invest, of favorable currency rates to invest heavily in U.S. real estate. And because of the strengthening yen, that's going to about to be non-viable, and we may just see some entire bubble economy collapses here. But this is Nintendo being caught basically on the edges of the collapse of the bubble economy, which is happening in large part due to currency rates, as dry a subject as that may be.
Well, and it is fascinating also, and there's a few reports about this, that Sega is also beginning to feel that pinch. We don't have any numbers directly from them this month, but they already started manufacturing in non-Japanese countries like Taiwan a few years before this. They started outsourcing a lot of their production, so they're not as tied to the yen as far as the manufacturing is concerned at this point. Nintendo is still manufacturing 85% of their hardware and software in Japan. And Nintendo's announcement hit the whole of the Japanese stock market because they were the second most profitable company in Japan after the big, I think it's a monopoly or quasi-monopoly, the communications company in Japan. They were the most profitable one. But Nintendo was the second most profitable one. And it caused and they, with some others, caused the Nintendo stock to lose almost 19% on one day. Now, Sega's expecting a 35 to 40% growth in its profit this year. So they're actually predicting profits to go up. Although that will still be a measly $250 million British pounds. I didn't do the exact math, but it comes out to about $500 million at this point, a little bit more than $500 million. It's just a fraction of Nintendo's earnings.
Yes, and of course, due to the issues that we talked about some in our last 1990s jump in September, this is somewhat illusory. Sega, because they're not getting hit on the manufacturing end, because they've transferred to Taiwan, they can look good right now because they're continuing to ship all of that Taiwan manufactured product into Europe and the United States. However, it turns out that stock is not going to sell in the volume they expected. And they are still incredibly dependent on their profit outlook for their sales in those territories, which means the increasingly strengthening yen and the loss in currency transfers is going to kill them on the back end. So Nintendo's feeling it now because of their manufacturing. Sega's like, we're still great, but they are going to have to pay that piper even worse than Nintendo once that product fails to sell in the field.
Well, especially because they don't have the profit margins that the Game Boy provides them. Let's see. Well, if you're not listening to Alex's other podcast, the one he does on the side when he's not here, They Create Worlds, he just did a wonderful 3-part series about the history of the handheld industry and the profitability of the Game Boy. At this point, is really going to buoy Nintendo in a way that Sega can't do. Now, Nintendo is trying to remedy this already. They've already moved some of their manufacturing to China. And they've also announced more moves of manufacturing to China in 1994. And so that is going to become a larger and larger portion. We've talked also last year or two about how China is beginning to pull more and more manufacturing at this point in time into China, which again is also going to lead to a lot of that bubble economy in Japan deflating because there won't be any manufacturing jobs to replace or to bolster it back up again because they're not coming back. They're going to China and they're going to stay in China.
Exactly.
So, it's
and Nintendo going to China is a real canary in the coal mine for that kind of thing, because while they're far from the first, obviously, to start doing that, they were a company that was always so insistent that only the Japanese could make this stuff to the level of quality we need. When they had the worldwide chip shortage in 88, 89, they refused to consider chips manufactured outside of Japan. And up to this point, they'd always refused to move their manufacturing outside of Japan. So when a company like Nintendo that is so pro-Japanese manufacturing is getting the heck out of Japanese manufacturing, it's not coming back.
Exactly. And so this is going to really, I'm using a lot of Japanese, English language Japanese business sources for these articles, but you really start to feel it in the way that they're describing these events. You really start to feel, this is meaningful. This really is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And
Oh, yeah. No, I was going to say, in that vein, despite Sega's bravado in the press, Sega calls for truce.
The ever-ballooning marketing costs fueled by the console wars has also apparently led to a war of hyperbole with both Sega and Nintendo, in the UK at least, fibbing about how big their massive ad spends around the holidays are. Sega has come out and called for a truce in this war for investor and consumer mindshare by proposing not to announce their ad spend if Nintendo won't, with all sides knowing that the numbers will be exaggerated anyway. It also isn't helping that most analysts expect this fall to be the peak for sales of this console generation, and the strong yen has made price cutting prohibitive, and thus bundling of big games with the consoles, the two big Japanese manufacturers' only real option to increase the perceived value of their systems.
See, this reminds me of, far more recently when Microsoft announced that they would stop reporting sales figures for the Xbox One and would instead report monthly users. The company that says, let's not report these things anymore, is the one that's embarrassed by the figures and doesn't want people to know how bad it is.
Exactly. I mean, there really is this idea that, we all know that their numbers are inflated. That's quite literally what he's telling the magazines. And we're not talking, just a flyby of a night magazine. He's actually reporting this in, I want to say, it was the Guardian. No, not the Guardian, but the Financial Times, the English Financial Times. So this is, the straight dope to investors, so to speak. And yeah, Sega, while they are still the dominant force in England, the control that they had of the console market, albeit a much smaller console market, less valuable console market in the Master System era, is beginning to dwindle. Nintendo, and we'll have a story towards the end of the episode where we see really how big that shift has started to become in Europe. But Nintendo is starting to grab a foothold. We talked, I think it was 2.5 years ago now, how Nintendo finally decided that Europe was worth going after. And it's starting to hit Sega. It really is.
Absolutely. But no, this definitely also reminds me of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's like, let's not bicker and argue over who outspent who. This is supposed to be a happy occasion.
Yeah. And the idea that they have to bundle software is a really dangerous thing, because every game that you give them is one less game that they're going to have to buy. Atari
exactly. No,
Atari knows all about that. Have you ever seen the bundles that they were selling the Atari ST with in the last couple of years of it?
Yes.
Here's 12 games. Go for it. Yes.
Yeah, a strategic limited time bundling can work for you. Look at Commodore when they did their Batman bundle and their Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles bundle, as they call them in the UK. But you can't just bundle like that. But this yen thing really is apocalyptic, and it's apocalyptic for Sega. And this is the side of the Sega story that doesn't really get told very often in all the romanticizing of the console wars that goes on. But we'll talk about it here, and I also did an episode on it at They Create Worlds. This is Sega about to just get pancaked by economic forces that are not entirely in their control.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And we will come back to the bundling in just a few short stories, but there's some more economic numbers we need to talk about before that.
Absolutely, because despite being a little shy about what they are or are not spending, Sega beats Nintendo in UK.
Sega has, according to Brit newspaper The Times, overtaken Nintendo in the UK, the only country where that apparently has happened, and Nintendo is not taking it lying down. Sega's anarchic attitude-filled ads will be countered by ads from Nintendo's new ad agency featuring British celeb Rick Mayall. I think that's how you pronounce his name. He was also in Blackadder. He played the flamboyant, what was the character's name?
Flashheart.
Yes.
I've got an idea, and it's as hot as my pants.
Oh, I gotta rewatch that series.
Treat your plane like you treat your woman. Get inside her 3 times a day and take her to heaven and back. I may be a fan of Blackadder.
You and me both, my friend. You and me both. Nintendo's estimated ad spend going into Christmas will be a £1 million per week in the UK.
Well, I guess the truce is off then. I guess the truce is off.
Yeah.
Couple of interesting things here. Some people may be saying, hey, well, Sega overtook Nintendo in the US too, didn't they? And the answer is yes, but not yet. Because those numbers will be reported at the beginning of 94, reporting back to 93.
Yeah.
The other thing is, just as a little bit of background on this, the sales figures thing in Britain has been controversial throughout the past few years. Nintendo had officially beaten Sega in 91 and 92, which is why we're saying, for the first time, Sega has overtaken Nintendo. But Sega claimed that the tracking agencies in the United Kingdom did not track small stores well. They only really tracked the large kind of high street retailers. And Nintendo had better distribution in the big chains, and Sega at least claimed that they had better distribution in the mom and pop stores. So they've been claiming for the last couple of years that their numbers are undercounted and that they've actually been doing better than Nintendo this whole time.
And my personal experience with this would also back that claim. I mean, it really does feel like that wasn't the reality on the ground. Now, again, it would be interesting to see if there was some better numbers that could be found somewhere for this. But, I mean, maybe software sales, if you compared software sales, maybe there's something to be found there. But it's difficult to tell.
All right, but moving away from the wars in the current generation to the next generation,
yes.
as Jaguar rollout plans revealed.
Atari has revealed that they will be rolling out the Jaguar in New York, San Francisco, London, and Paris in November and December. The system purports to be much more powerful than the 3DO and trounces current 16-bit systems. While the CD add-on is already shown and the potential introduction of modems and VR gear are talked about, the real issue will be third-party support, with only Time Warner being given as a third party.
Which is practically cheating because they still own a chunk of Atari Corporation and, of course, have taken over the other half of the old Atari games, and so
yeah. They really have no third party support at this point, and it gets worse because several magazines have previews of them this month. GamePro previews a few games. They have a screenshot of Tiny Toons, a side-scrolling jump and run, which, we have a demo of it nowadays. It would have looked shameful already on the Genesis. It's not good. Never gets finished. Whole page is dedicated to Crescent Galaxy. That's the whatever it was called, something McFur.
Yes, Travis McFur.
Travis McFur, the Jaguar, and with his side...
Or Trevor. Was it Trevor?
Trevor McFur, that's it, yeah.
Yes, it was Trevor, not Travis.
Yeah, and what I never realized, but they pointed out in the article that he's supposed to be a Jaguar, and the sidekick, I guess, player 2 character is supposed to be a Lynx. Get it? Jaguar Lynx. But yeah, I mean, if you've ever played that game for more than a minute, there's something wrong with you, because nobody should play for more than a minute. Just terrible, terrible side scroller. And then there's the first shots of Alien vs. Predator, but everybody is just like, yeah, the Wolfenstein style game, as one magazine called it, is just bare bones and nothing more than just walking around the maze. At this point. Now, it will become a much better game, but at this point, it's just that.
And, of course, by the time it's released, they won't be calling them Wolfenstein-style games anymore either.
No. That may have passed by then.
Yes, indeed. Well, I mean, the Jaguar, I mean, the chips had horrible bugs in them that the Trammels refused to let them get around to fixing. Plus, they never gave the proper support to software, so they're trying to introduce the system that they claim is going to be a new benchmark in 3D. But what are these first releases? They're side-scrolling games like the 16-bit games, except with a hardware that isn't designed to do all that fast sprite movement and tiled backgrounds that make that kind of thing viable. So these original games that they're showing off are basically what the current 16-bit consoles are doing, except slower and dumber.
Yeah, exactly. And, well, if you want to check out my interview with Leonard Trammell, where he talks about how they knew that there was a problem with how the machine moved memory around, which basically created a giant bottleneck in the system and slowed it down to a crawl. Mm-hmm. And they were not allowed to fix it, because then they would have missed even this limited Christmas launch. And they probably should have missed this limited Christmas launch, because they will not have the software necessary to really make a dent in anything. But yeah. And again, we'll talk about how this is Atari's last Hail Mary a little bit later again, but it is their last Hail Mary, and it's not good looking.
And speaking of things that are not good looking, EGM goes hands-on with 3DO.
3DO has given Electronic Gaming Monthly the ability to test drive their new $699.95 video game system. The only game they get to play was the pack entitled Crash and Burn by up-and-coming hitmaker Crystal Dynamics. EGM's assessment: the system is as good as the arcades and nothing can beat it.
Okay, boomer.
Well, I mean,
now in fairness, Crash and Burn was a fairly impressive game for the time.
Oh, more than fairly impressive. I mean, if you're considering what else is on the market. Now, remember, Ridge Racer, the first textured racing game in the arcades, has just debuted. So the reviewer playing this has probably not played that yet. So in the arcades, the best looking thing you've got is Virtua Racer. And now here you have, Crash and Burn is using a pre-rendered model for the car. But the rest of the world looks like, textured 3D moving world, and you get to shoot stuff with guns. And you're doing it on a home system? It's impressive as hell at this moment in time. It's not going to hold up for long.
Now, Carl, was this demo really done on a system, though, that would approximate what the good people at home would actually be playing this game on?
Well, that is an excellent question, because Edge Magazine cast some doubt on the 3DO's alleged performance, with journalist Barry Fox claiming that when he hit the eject button on the console he was playing a racing game on at the Chicago CES, and there were two racing game demos. We're not sure which one, if it was Crash and Burn or this other game that never gets released. The disc tray was empty, and the controller cables went to an Apple Quadras that were behind the booth. So it could be. Now, this is at the Chicago CES in July. June or July? When is Chicago CES?
June.
So it's possible that the EGM people actually played real hardware later on. Right. But, the fact that they had gone to CES with the Quadras running it is not a good look. Definitely not a good look.
Absolutely.
But in all fairness, and Edge does also point this out, that he was playing it at the Panasonic booth. The people at Panasonic told him that it was real hardware. But Trip Hawkins had been telling everybody that at CES that the real hardware was not ready yet. Yes, thank you. And it gets a little bit worse because there's also an interview with Becky Heineman, who at this point had just done the 3DO port of Out of This World. And she cast some real shade on 3DO with a quote saying that she hasn't seen a single, quote, seen a single game yet that says this is why I have a 3DO. Because she said it's all flash and the gameplay of these games sucks. And that probably is also because the number one maker of software so far for the 3DO, or will be for the launch, is Crystal Dynamics, a brand new company. Lots of startup funding, some Hollywood talent in there, but no actual games released previously. And they're doing Crash and Burn and Total Eclipse.
Yeah. Well, and kind of very similar to Epix and the Lynx. What happened here is, Crystal Dynamics was formed by two former Sega marketing people. But then when Needle and Michael decided to do the 3DO, their good buddy David Morse, just like the last time David Morse went to Epix to have them do the Lynx, David Morse muscled in to Crystal Dynamics in order to focus Crystal Dynamics on the 3DO.
Oh,
that's what happened here. Is David Morse joined Crystal Dynamics as the CEO specifically to support his buddies Needle and Michael to be a software provider. So I don't know a lot about the founding of Crystal Dynamics, but it is very possible that the company had not necessarily been planning to pivot right away to these next gen consoles, but then David Morse came and was like, "No, we're doing 3DO."
That makes a lot of sense, and I understand why and how, and it makes a lot of sense in that context. Now, whether or not they actually have the talent necessary to pull something like this off, I mean, when you look at some of their later games like Gex, I'd say no. And this is another thing. Heinemann, she also mentions in this interview with her in Edge magazine that she had actually found several bugs in the 3DO hardware that the 3DO people didn't even know were there as she's doing Out of This World. And I mean, she's not doing the 3D stuff yet. She's just doing 2D stuff for Out of This World. Or Another World, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on. So,
right.
I mean, how well thought through this entire process is a tough one, but $700 is just not really a palatable proposition.
No, especially with the sharks beginning to circle as Nintendo signs up Silicon Graphics.
Nintendo has penned a deal with Silicon Graphics to design their next console. The 64-bit project has been dubbed Project Reality and promises to bring the power that made Jurassic Park possible to homes everywhere. Of course, the announcement is a bit early, and Nintendo just asks everyone to hold off on a next-gen purchase until 1995. Surely it won't be another piece of vaporware like their CDI player, the Sony PlayStation, their 32-bit system, and so on.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, there is.
It won't come out in 95, but it's fine.
Yeah, there is some serious derision in the editorial pages this month of various game magazines, because this is literally the fifth new hardware platform that Nintendo has announced in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And, the little boy who cried wolf can only cry wolf so many times. And, so this whole idea of, just hold off, don't make another purchase, we'll get you, is just not going to sit well with a lot of people.
Yeah, and I wish we knew more about the development of the N64. We know a little bit on the Silicon Graphics side, thanks to some interviews that have been done by our very own Department of Corrections, Ethan Johnson. But on the Japanese side, on the Nintendo side, I wish we knew more. We do know that Silicon Graphics was not Nintendo's first choice. Jim Clark and Tom Kalinske knew each other, and so they had approached Sega first. And Sega turned them down for a partnership, and then only after that went to Nintendo. I assume, the SNES development was apparently a nightmare, and I'm assuming that Nintendo has gotten to the point where it's, quite frankly, incapable of internally doing the next generation of hardware, that they don't have the expertise. I have to imagine they must have been scrambling at this point. Because if they had anything reasonable ready to go up against the Saturn or the PlayStation in 1994 in Japan, surely they would have done so. So I imagine Nintendo must have hit a brick wall in development to turn to Silicon Graphics at this juncture.
And this is where I would look back at the previous story we talked about. Nintendo made a big deal about the fact that they had kept their internal costs down through limiting themselves to their 890 employees, even though the software output has jumped dramatically. I mean, they're not just supporting one system, they're supporting 2 systems, 3 systems, really, when you think about it. There's still games coming out for the NES, but they haven't increased the number of people. This is where the reliance on Argonaut to do the Super FX chip comes into play. Mm-hmm. They've shut down we talked about this last year, they shut down their coin-op division, which at this point was only Super Nintendo and NES clones anyway. But that means that they have nobody working on next-generation hardware the way Sega does, for example. The way Namco is going to assist or help the PlayStation by, knowing what works and what doesn't work, because you've got the more expensive arcade hardware to basically test run concepts on. And this is another thing that was also mentioned in one of the articles, that, Nintendo, other than Game Boy and Super NES or Super Famicom in Japan, doesn't have the diversity of markets to withstand big hits. They mentioned that the Sega still has the arcade. The home market may go down, they still got the arcade business. Obviously, I don't know how helpful that really is in the bigger picture, but Nintendo has basically, the Germans have a phrase, sich zum Tode sparen. You save yourself to death, and save in the sense of saving money. They limited their growth in order to give this perception to the outside world, but what it's also done is starve them of talent in key areas when they should have been bulking it up in the years when things were going really well. So yeah, I think that your assumption is probably very, very close to reality. They know approximately what's going on elsewhere. They knew Daytona was coming. That's been previewed for a long time. They know Sega's going to try to get that on their next console. Mode 7 is not going to save them forever. The Super FX chip is definitely not there. And they probably have a feeling that Sony is not going to let this PlayStation thing die. there is competition coming down the pipeline. They needed somebody to give them chips, and this is also what so many of the people in the U.S. arcade business kept talking about, and about, the U.S. had the technological advantage. They just didn't have the game design advantage over the Japanese. It's, if you wanted high tech, it was still coming from the U.S. manufacturers. Namco gets its 3D hardware and original 3D stuff from Atari. I mean, Stun Runner leads to Ridge Racer, and so on and so forth. Digitized graphics.
Well, and then, right. And then, of course, both Namco and Sega partnering at the beginning of the 90s with American defense contractors.
Exactly.
Which is how they get their more advanced texture-mapped 3D graphical hardwares, both of them. And where Virtua Fighter comes from as well, is partnering with those American companies.
Yeah. And so Nintendo has to, not only are they now moving their manufacturing out of Japan, their technical know-how is also coming from the U.S.
Exactly.
So,
and certainly there's a lot of technology to go around as we get CGI versus claymation versus digitization.
Interplay has announced 2 console titles, Clay Fighters and Claymates, that will use digitized stop-motion clay figures for its graphics. This comes as Sierra is preparing a VGA remake of Quest for Glory 1 using a similar technique. This comes as a plethora of games from Betrayal at Krondor to Mortal Kombat are going the route of digitized actors, and Mirage Studios is showing off its first images of its CGI pre-rendered fighting extravaganza, Rise of the Robots, and the first images of Myst wow onlookers with its pre-rendered world. Which technique will ultimately win over in the quickly evolving fight for graphical supremacy and finally quash the aging look of pixel-based art? Or maybe it'll be a hybrid of techniques, as in the much hyped this month Demolition Man for the 3DO that promises to use digitized sprites filmed on blue screens, brand new FMV with the film stars, and pre-rendered scenery. Now we just need some claymation added to that mix.
Yeah, there is a huge emphasis on the graphics in this period, and we've talked about this in the context of the multimedia revolution and all of that as well. But just with the Silicon Graphics story up above, I think is a good reminder that I think a lot of this push is coming from outside of the video game and computer industries as well. The fact that Silicon Graphics has made a lot of headlines with its T-1000 in Terminator 2 and its dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, all made using computers, the public is getting a different idea of what computers can output. Now, they don't know how much time and effort and money it takes to do that. There's the famous story with Steve Jobs when he went a couple years later, went to see a game being made by a game company and said, this is shit. My guys at Pixar are doing graphics way more amazing in this than Toy Story. And the person just responded, okay, Steve, and how long does it take them to render one frame of Toy Story? Which shut him up. But I think the public is starting, because of the advances being made in the film industry, to expect more out of computer graphics, and video game and computer game companies are struggling to figure out how to deliver that new customer demand.
Very, very true. It's and I think there's also this feeling that it's getting more competitive and getting that initial sale through flashy graphics on the package, flashy graphics on in a magazine is going to get you that shelf space. There's so many more companies jumping in now. Like we said with Crystal Dynamics, there's startup money coming into this. It's been a while since startup capital has been looking at video game makers as viable options. And I think that people like Trip Hawkins bringing their prestige and their charisma to the 3DO is making this more appealing. It's no longer a small niche. You've got companies like Panasonic producing. You've got Sony's name being bandied around in conjunction with the Nintendo PlayStation. It feels like bigger things are coming.
And it's also the very, very early beginnings of what's about to become the .com bubble. Where the .com bubble hasn't started yet, but the multimedia revolution that's supposed to come has been capturing people's attention, and the World Wide Web is about to become a thing. And so the entire kind of zeitgeist is shifting towards that idea of technology as a lucrative space to invest money that will ultimately end in the .com bubble, of course.
And it's not just I think that plays a role for big corporations or government. It's technology in everyday people's hands.
Absolutely. And then the other thing you talked about, which really is a big deal, is the shelf space thing, because computer games especially, I mean, video games have already been mainstream through the NES since the late 80s, but because of the promise of multimedia, the lowering price of PCs due to the price competition between the various clone makers, and the fact that the technology has progressed to the point that you're getting some high-profile games like Myst and Doom about to come along, computer gaming is starting to go mainstream in a way that it never has been before. And this means that they are starting to get sales in discount stores, department stores, places that they didn't before. And these places have limited shelf space for these products and do not want to have to buy from too many different companies. And so we're about to see, and it's already begun a little bit, Origin has already been bought by Electronic Arts back in 92. We're going to start seeing this move in the computer game space in the United States towards more and more consolidation, and its shelf space pressure and retail distribution pressure that is largely going to drive that consolidation. Getting into the mainstream ends up being a real double-edged sword.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's exciting. Nobody knows where it's going to go, and I think the real problem is nobody knows what to do with the CD
yet. Exactly. That is definitely a big part of it.
Yeah.
In the meantime, though, we still have that old reliable 16-bit generation plugging along, and here we have Nintendo gives away Super Mario All-Stars.
If you purchase the $149 version of the SNES, the Super Set, that included Super Mario World, you can send in a mail-in coupon to get a free copy of Super Mario All-Stars. Just $3.50 postage required.
It's a good deal.
It's a good deal, but it's also a real sign of a desperation move.
It certainly is.
This should be like their biggest seller. There's even a quote from, I believe, Peter Main in Edge magazine when they asked him about the 3DO console, and he said, well, we'll probably make more revenue off of Super Mario All-Stars this year than they'll make off of 3DO and all of its software. And he's probably not wrong, but at the same time, they're going to be giving this away. It's going to become the new pack-in title. And then they're going to enhance it by adding Super Mario World to a later version of the same cartridge.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely a couple of things going on here. First, this is a clear sign that Nintendo is feeling the Sega pressure worse than they ever have before. Of course, this is going to be the year that, as we mentioned previously in the episode, that Sega is finally going to overtake Nintendo in the United States. And you can see that they clearly feel that they need, and it's the same as the bundling thing we were talking about in the UK. The fact that they really can't engage in price cuts right now due to the strengthening yen means that they're having to look to other methods of enticement, usually involving software, and this is one of those. But the other thing that this is starting to show is it's presumably starting to show that there is about to be a huge software glut in the 16-bit market. I'm assuming that Nintendo probably had some softer retailer orders than they expected, that their projections are not looking so rosy, and we are about to hit a period where software sales suddenly start eroding in the market. It's I did an episode on this where we called it the crash that wasn't, or the crash that almost was, because we're going to see market conditions very, very similar to the crash in 1982, 83, 84, and we're only just going to barely avert calamity. And this is, I think, one of the first signs that this is coming.
Yeah, and this is another one of these stories that we've been covering over the last year and a half, where the pressure from the U.S. government's investigation into Nintendo's monopolistic behaviors forced their hand to loosen their grip on their third parties. And that has meant a lot more software coming out, not just on the Super NES. So that whole limit of how many games a publisher can release per year, but also the fact that those same publishers are now also releasing games on the Genesis, which means now you've got all of that. And I think, I don't want to overstate this, but the fact that you also have the handhelds out there means that now you also have software for the Game Boy and, to a lesser extent, the Game Gear, all on the market at the same time. Is a lot of software, a lot of different platforms, and the amount and the number of dollars pursuing that software has not increased. So,
exactly.
If little Johnny
and that's exactly what we had in 1982, pretty much.
Yeah.
Is the exact same thing, where there's been so much demand for so long, but now the floodgates have opened, and for the first time, supply is really eclipsing demand. I mean, the market was not as supply constrained in the early 90s, I think, as the Atari market was in the early 80s. But still, because of that loosening, like you said, we're seeing a flood, and it's really recreating 1982. And not to spoil the ending, but really the only thing that makes this different than the last time is the last time around nobody really understood console cycle transitions, and the next generation of consoles, the Atari 5200s and ColecoVisions of the world, just weren't enough of a leap to be a credible new console generation. But this time, we're going to get the PlayStation.
Yeah. We're going to get a PlayStation. The PCs that are coming into homes are doing games that no console was thought capable of doing. And that's going to really up the ante in a way that the 83 crash was not. It wasn't an issue as much in the 83 crash.
Absolutely. And speaking of some of those fantastic computer games like none had seen, turns out that Wolfenstein 3D to come to the SNES.
Imagineer of Japan is bringing id Software's first-person shooter to Nintendo's latest console. id themselves are responsible for the port. Who needs the latest hardware when you can play the best PC title on a console?
I and still do. I mean, it's still around. I had this port because in this period of time, we still had a relatively old 286 from the mid-'80s. And so I didn't. I played Wolfenstein at friends' houses, but I did not at this time have a computer capable of running Wolfenstein 3D in my home. So I played this port. It's very competently done. It's not as fast. It's not as blazing fast, of course, as the PC game, and they had to make some changes, like replacing the German Shepherds with rats and getting rid of blood and stuff. But because id did the port themselves, unlike many other somewhat infamous ports of id games over the next few years, this one's pretty solid on the whole.
Yeah, it's pretty solid. I find it interesting that it's being announced just shortly before the hearings on violence in video games, and it's coming. Mm-hmm. It's a game where you're running around with a gun shooting people. And, of course, it doesn't get mentioned by Howard Lincoln when he's giving his presentation. I find it very curious from a timing standpoint that this was clearly known that this was coming, because it's already in the magazines and there's screenshots of it already. But he just somehow did not brief Mr. Lieberman on that in their private discussions when he was lambasting those bastards at Sega. So, and if you want more about this, everybody, like I've said before, go and listen to our commentary track. I find it highly entertaining.
Great plug. Yeah. Great plug.
Yeah, but it's still, I for some reason I had this much later in the timeline, and when I ran across this, I was like, you dirty bastard.
Yeah. But pivoting away from Nintendo to their erstwhile competitor, Sega does sports.
Sega has announced a new consolidated effort to expand its sports offerings. The Sega Sports label will be bringing more sports titles to their family of systems, including the Genesis, Sega CD, and Game Gear.
Genesis does sports.
It does sports. It does sports very well. The magazines do sort of bring up the fact that EA is synonymous at this point with Genesis Sports, as many of the offerings, yes, including Montana 2 and so forth, aren't nearly as good as the EA offerings. And there's another little tempest in a teapot this month because EA has announced that they're going to bring out a 4-player adapter for the Genesis that is only compatible with EA sports games, as opposed to Sega's 4-player adapter, which apparently is already out, works with games like Gauntlet 4, but still nobody quite knows why EA is bringing out their own one.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting point as well. But yeah, I mean, there's a real battle going on here because both EA and Sega are so known for sports now, but it's all EA product. And Sega is definitely a little salty about this. And I mean, this tug of war between the two companies is going to continue right up until the end of Sega's adventures in hardware, when EA famously refuses to back the Dreamcast because Sega is going to release their own sports games, and EA wants them not to as a condition of appearing on the platform.
And that is something EA can do once they have a certain type of monopoly on sports.
Indeed. And speaking of EA Sports, EA announces EA Sports Soccer.
EA is expanding its sports lineup, which now sports the catchy slogan, if it's in the game, it's in the game, with a soccer title for the Genesis.
They're an American company. Americans don't like soccer. That game will never go anywhere.
No, definitely not. Now, for those who might be listening to this in the distant future, there's a point in time when the EA's soccer game was known as FIFA Soccer.
Yes.
At the time we're recording this, it's no longer known as FIFA Soccer. But for 30 years, it was known as FIFA Soccer. And EA Sports Soccer will be released as FIFA Soccer, although the shots shown of it at this point in time do not have the FIFA license yet.
Yeah. And I mean, this was a real skunkworks. Like there was no, because EA is an American company. There was really no enthusiasm for this, but a couple of guys of theirs in Britain got together with all the fine folks in Canada at Distinctive and kind of made this thing happen. And then, of course, it became one of the twin pillars. Madden for the US, FIFA for everywhere else.
Oh, yeah.
Sports dominance.
Yeah. And so much so that, apparently they can do just fine without that FIFA license, as long as they have the player's license.
Indeed.
Yeah, once they lock down these licenses, these franchises become so powerful that it's almost impossible to beat them.
Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, at the time, nobody really cared about or knew who FIFA were either. I mean, obviously people cared about the World Cup, but nobody knew about FIFA. Really, EA almost did more for FIFA than FIFA did for EA, and it's because it was the license they could get. They couldn't get the soccer licenses or the football licenses that they really wanted, but they needed a license because they always licensed, so they got that FIFA license. And I think that boosted FIFA's profile in the world more than FIFA boosted EA's
Oh, definitely.
profile
I mean,
in soccer.
I didn't know what FIFA was before this. I mean, it suddenly FIFA became a household name amongst gamers, and that spread it very, very quickly to normal sports enthusiasts who normally wouldn't have known about it.
Absolutely. And finally, to wrap up our console news with getting a little motion going, Sega introduces the Activator.
Nice one. What do you do when your console is getting long in the tooth? Introduce awesome new add-ons like the Activator.
Oh, man. I have never used an Activator, of course. Who would? But yeah, motion control. That's going to work really well.
And for those who are not in the know, you can always, of course, click on the links. Remember, links to everything we talk about in the show notes. The Activator was, I believe, an octagonal ring that you laid on the ground, and then if you swiped your hand over different positions, it would basically activate like a normal,
or any other body part. You could punch, you could kick, you could dive, right out of the circle, I suppose.
Yeah, and it would then send an input to the game. So in theory, you were controlling the game this way. Absolute waste. Like we mentioned up above, they had a Dragon Ball fighting game that used these controls in the arcades. That was actually a first-person split-screen Dragon Ball game. And yeah, it's crap. You don't really need to know more about it than that. And it is
definitely not over 9,000.
I'm not a Dragon Ball watcher, but even I get that reference. So
I'm not either, and that just shows you how pervasive that reference is. All right, moving on to handheld gaming, I guess. We have one headline here. Move over Game Boy, Newton is here.
Apple's latest hardware introduction, the handheld Newton, will bring work into the 21st century with its stylus, note-taking, calendaring, faxing, and other office functions, to say nothing of its amazing handwriting recognition abilities. Apple sees the future of the message pad, as they call it, as the future of tech, with them being used in cars for navigation and coming in a variety of sizes. Yeah.
Rest in peace, Newton.
Yes. We hardly knew ye, and that was good. So yeah, the Newton is too early. is too fixated on the concept of recreating handwritten notepads as opposed to realizing that keyboards are truly more efficient and nobody really needs handwriting in a computer age.
Yeah.
And
it basically brought the downfall of the Scully regime, because John Scully really, really pushed this thing even as it kept getting delayed. They worked on it for years. As it kept getting delayed and it kept getting more compromised, Scully continued to push because he thought this was the future of Apple, and spoiler alert, it was not.
No. It's kind of ironic that the future of Apple was going to be handheld portable technology,
right.
But that future was going to rely on universally available wireless networks that you could buy shit off of. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, oh well.
Yeah, I think the Game Boy is going to be safe for now.
Yeah, just a little bit longer.
Moving on then to actual computer news. Real Magic wants to bring FMV to the PC.
While many attempts had been made to bring video footage to the PC, the limitations of storage and processing have so far kept video in small windows with jerky frame rates. eMotion's new Real Magic add-on card aims to change all of that. Will users adopt a new hardware standard?
If it's called Voodoo, maybe.
Yeah, I included this one not because it's truly unique, because there's a lot of different hardware solutions similar to this one popping up on the market, but it really is, and I've talked about this before, and I just find it fascinating, that the question of the open PC architecture being, well, what are the core components of a PC? How do those change? I mean, the original PC, no sound card. The idea of introducing the sound card, that was the first major add-on component to the PC since the original introduction of the machine in 1982. That was the first time that you had a new piece that went in that was a requirement, basically, for the machine to be useful. And now you keep getting, we haven't talked about it here. It's been done, but it was so overpriced that nobody really talked about it in the normal press that we cover. We already have the first attempt at a 3D accelerator, which was Silicon Graphics' attempt at that. And we'll see that come back. But that's still about a year away. We're going to see that rear its head again.
Yeah. Well, it's just, and it's this continuing disconnect, because we were promised the multimedia revolution via the set-top box companies, back in the late 80s.
Yeah.
And the technology just wasn't there. But the people have already been sold on this bill of goods. And so now there's this almost desperation to try to make it a reality through any means necessary, because consumers have been buying computers in part because of this promise that little Johnny and little Susie are going to be left behind if they don't get on the multimedia bandwagon. And then they get the computers and there's just nothing there. And I think they're at real risk of losing the general public if they go on promising a revolution that never materializes for much longer.
That is definitely true. And it's also a sign of, like you said, the appetite for it is there. And everybody's trying to do this. We've talked already about the CDI is finally going to get its FMV add-on. The CD32 has an FMV add-on. And what do you do with it? What happens once you get that is still an open question, because you can't do it yet. It's just not there yet.
Spoiler alert, the answer is, as it has always been, porn.
Oh, so true. Well, we have mentioned that already. It isn't a spoiler. We've talked about the porn last month, but yes.
Absolutely. We sure did. But, this brings up another good point, though, because you do talk about what is a PC anymore. And we're seeing such a proliferation of peripherals and even of different configurations of base models as more and more clone makers get into the market, that this is becoming a real issue, not just for the consumer, but also for the software industry itself, which leads directly to our next headline, Buggy Software on the Rise.
This month's editorial in Computer Game Review and CD-ROM Entertainment, probably the worst name ever for a magazine, but oh well, focuses on the increasing problem of buggy software. According to editor Steve Honeywell, a, quote, constant rash of games floating into the CGR offices with fatal errors and annoying bugs, end quote, is making reviewing hard, and consumers should vote with their dollars to teach companies to improve their quality control standards, and that if companies start to lose revenue, they will be more likely to improve quality in the future.
This reminds me of today's cry to don't pre-order games. But it's true. But it's true. This is a period of such rapid technological change where it's impossible for any computer game company anymore to take into account every last configuration of hardware, both in terms of what pieces of hardware you have in there, but also in terms of the relative power of different computer models. It's not only is the software itself becoming more complicated, but the hardware environment that the software is being released into is just chaos at this point.
That is definitely true. And as more and more attempts at adding hardware to the PC appear, it's just going to get worse and worse. And obviously, Microsoft is going to stabilize that once Manhattan hits, aka Windows 95.
Chicago.
Sorry, not Manhattan. Chicago. You're right. Thank you. But at this point in time, in a DOS world, because this is still a DOS world despite every attempt to make Windows 3.1 into a game platform, it's a nightmare. It's a freaking nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, we both grew up in this world, and I know I've talked about it on the show before, but I mean, boot disks, edits of AutoExecBat and ConfigSys, IRQ hell with sound cards. Yes, you were on an Amiga where everything works.
I had my Amiga, I popped in a floppy disk, and it worked. You guys were wasting your lives with that stuff. Yeah. If it all worked out after 12 hours, you got to play Ultima Underworld. But
expanded memory, extended memory.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's a world, and this is right in the heart of that, and it's just that's a lot of why the software is so buggy. I mean, I'm sure there are some things that the companies could do to reform their processes, reform their pipelines to catch a little more. They are taken off guard a little bit by how big this software is getting now. But I don't think quality control standards, improved quality control standards would help with most of what this magazine is seeing, because it's not the software's fault all the time. It is often the hardware's fault.
I'm currently conducting an interview with Gary Bayless, who's currently at Neverwhere Studio. No, not Neverwhere. The guys who make the Mortal Kombat games. NetherRealm. Thank you. But, I mean, he goes all the way back to the late 70s. And he also was the guy who set up the quality control apparatus at SSI back in the day. At this, a little bit before this, but especially at this point in time when all these different configurations were there. And I asked him about it, and he said, yeah, this became this constant battle of, what configuration could possibly be here today, which configuration could come. But the real problem that they had was that so many of the developers were outside. They would be working. The developers don't have these 10 machines in front of them. They send a build in for testing, and okay, great. The last build worked. This new build has a bug at point A with this hardware. Now you got to fix that bug, but now you've caused another bug in another section. It's just, there's no standards, and if you're trying to make it run a little bit faster and you're finding some way around it, you can't rely on it running on everything. I mean, writing to the metal, we're still in the period of time when there's clone chips. We haven't moved to Pentiums yet as standard gaming hardware. So, it's a 486, but not all 486s are equally born, So it's
exactly.
A real pain in the ass.
It truly is. Meanwhile, across the pond, Center Gold prepares for stock launch.
Center Gold, the parent company of UK publisher US Gold, is expected to raise £20 million from its initial offering. While a big chunk of the money will go to the company's management, $10 million will be left over for new development and expansion of the company's operations both in Europe and the UK. This is coming on the explosive growth of the video game console market in the UK, which was valued at just £190 million in 1992, but is valued at a whopping £900 million in 1993. This despite, or maybe because of, game hardware costs approximately 3 times as much in the UK as it does in Japan.
Yeah, very, very few British game companies were ever able to go public, which is a big part of the reason why the industry was eclipsed there in the 90s, because both American and French companies had much more success going public. I presume that the ace up the sleeve of Center Gold is that they were not just a publisher and developer, but they were also one of the largest distributors of games in the United Kingdom as well.
Oh, definitely. I mean, US Gold, and especially if you go into Commodore 64 forums, get ravaged for the quality of their product. But they were also probably the only publisher that got in on the cartridge market. If you look at their output on the Sega Master System, they were porting old Epyx games. They had craptacular games like Strider 2, but they were at least there on the market. Ocean is...
Because they could use the... Oh, I was going to say just because they could use the strength of their distribution market to offset some of those higher costs, or distribution network, to offset some of those higher costs in game development.
Oh, definitely. So, but they're going to make this jump, and this money is definitely going to help them. And, well, somewhere along the line, there's going to be a company called Eidos.
Yeah, that's right. Well, technically that company already exists at this time. They're just making video compression software at this time, not games.
Yes.
You should try to get in touch with Jeff Brown. He'd talk to you.
You think so? Okay. I'll have to do that because, I've done way too few interviews with the European side of things.
I think Jeff Brown would talk to you.
Okay, then this is a new goal. Jeff Brown, you're on the list.
And hearkening back to a few topics we were talking about just a few articles before, Apple goes multimedia.
Yeah, sorry. Everything's a little eclectic today. It was hard to find a good through line for some of this. Apple has launched 2 new machines, the Quadra and the Centris, which are designed to be multimedia systems sporting CD-ROM drives and video input options.
Yeah, more of Scully just completely misunderstanding. He came from soft drinks. It makes sense to have the Pepsi and the Diet Pepsi and the Cherry Pepsi and the Crystal Pepsi. But, he really fragments Apple's approach to the computer market in a way that I don't think was probably helpful.
No, I mean, I looked a little bit at the specs of these machines. There's no clear explanation for what the purpose of these devices are.
Exactly.
And, I mean, for video production, they're not a fix on the existing video toaster standard with their video input and so forth. And they're so much more expensive that it makes absolutely
I'll tell you what they're for, Carl. They're for running fake 3DO demos.
I mean, yeah, they're using them as 3DO dev kits, but that's a very expensive 3DO dev kit.
Well, I mean, that's why the console's $700, right? I mean, you got to recoup those costs somewhere. And speaking of the multimedia world, EA plans to ditch floppies.
Yes, while the dawn of CD has been an ongoing topic for a while now on the show, EA president Mark Lewis is the first major publishing head to publicly say that he expects the company to only be releasing games on CD and cartridge within the next 2 years, even though no single EA-labeled game has launched on CD yet.
And this is, of course, the president of EA in the UK, specifically.
Yes.
Mark Lewis. This is in the European context. Yeah, I mean, it's something that has to happen because basically floppy disk costs are just killing everybody. Obviously, CD can hold more, but even on comparably smaller games that don't need to take up all 650 megabytes on a CD, it's getting to the point that releasing a game on floppy disk for that is 4, 5, 6 discs in length is killing companies on production costs. A big part of what killed Origin and forced them to seek a buyer in Electronic Arts was that the Wing Commander franchise got too successful for its own good, because Wing Commander 2 was selling great and the production costs on the discs were destroying them.
And he actually says this in this interview. He says the average game is now shipping on 7 to 10 floppy disks. And the cost of goods is killing them. It's not just the manufacturing cost. You have to ship these things, and shipping is weight. You are moving based on weight. It's not like there's an EA truck with 5,000 units on it, and then they don't care about the weight any longer. They're shipping these things, 2-3 boxes at a time to a store through mail services, and how much that big cardboard box, remember, we're still in the age of the beautiful big cardboard PC box, that's going to cost you money.
Yep. The 3 games I really remember that, personally, were X-Wing, TIE Fighter, and Master of Orion. Those are 3 games that I had. A friend had X-Wing, but I had the other 2 that they came on just huge number of discs.
Yeah.
You just had to keep switching them out during that install. It was getting nuts. So definitely the right way to go here, Mr. Mark Lewis.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, it's going to be true. They're not going to be selling anything on floppy within the next 2 years.
And we end our PZ coverage on a lighter note as Sam and Max hit the road for some pizza party testing.
German magazine ASM reports that the team working on Sam & Max Hit the Road, the upcoming LucasArts adventure title, have put the game to the traditional in-house pizza party test, where employees from outside the team are invited to a pizza party while they test and critique the game. And I just included this because this was the first time I've known about this process inside LucasArts for a long time, but this is the first time I've run across an article talking about it. And it's such an interesting very much lost aspect of corporate game development. I mean, you couldn't do this nowadays with a game that's got, let's say, 100 or 200 people working on it. To just say, hey, everybody from the other departments, come on by, we'll have a pizza party and try the game out. I can't see that happening nowadays anymore. And I think that it just feels like a throwback to a different era that just at this time, like we were saying, with the dawn of FMV, with the dawn of the more complex game, just is about to become extinct.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Moving on briefly to our online news, more details of AT&T deal to buy TSN emerge.
U.S. telephone giant AT&T purchased 20% of Sierra Online's online platform, the Sierra Network, back in June. More details are emerging from the deal, which gives the telephone giant the option to buy the online service outright, as TSN will be renamed the Imagination Network. Support for the 3DO multiplayer and the Sega Genesis through the Edge 16 modem peripheral will be added, as well as online communities and customized avatars. AT&T will also be providing Sierra with $5 million to develop more games for the service, which already includes classic board games like Chess and Go, as well as Red Baron and Shadow of Iserbius.
Yeah, AT&T's making a move here, but it's not surprising because in this kind of nebulous period before the worldwide network took over everything, there was, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past, there was still a lot of ambiguity around what the online connected future was going to look like. And for the telecommunications companies, the telephone and the cable companies, all they knew is we have the infrastructure. It is logical that we could capture this new online space, whatever that ends up being, but we need content for the infrastructure or we won't be able to take our natural place at the head of this new world order, which is why we've had so many stories over the past several months of these jumps about telecommunications companies making big showy investments in networking stuff, modem stuff, whatever.
Exactly. And it's interesting also to see how complex these networks already are and how much the online life that we lead today is already starting to take shape. There's an article in the New York Times this month about these online communities. They actually talk about TSN in that article, and they're talking about how younger people are building very complex friendships and relationships with people that they've never even been in the same room with. I mean, not dissimilar to you and me. I mean, I consider you a very close friend, a very dear friend, and we've never even been, never knowingly been in the same place at the same time.
That's right. We are like ships passing in the night. We may have been in the same downtown Atlanta hotel at the exact same moment.
Exactly. But, yeah, and they talk about this phenomenon, and it's quite interesting to read because, you know, they're already talking about people playing games together, you know, eloping and all this stuff. The stuff that we associate really with what will come from the dot-com boom 5-6 years later. They're already, this is already happening, but on a much smaller scale in these private, closed-off networks.
Absolutely. And of course, even before that, it was already happening in even smaller closed-off networks like MUDs.
Exactly.
It's just, it's slowly, it's like concentric circles. It is slowly over the course of decades encompassing more and more of the population until we've ended up whatever online Web 2.0 hellscape this is that we're living through now.
All we needed was a pandemic. Congratulations.
Right. The one missing ingredients. All right. Moving on to our kind of eclectic what else is going on in the world section.
Sorry, this is now the publications.
Oh, wait,
Sorry,
you're right.
Yes.
You're right. You're right. Moving on to our publications section, Arnie Katz argues for National Electronic Gaming Convention.
Yes, and I'm going to come back up here since I changed the color. There we go. After the cancellation of further public access days at CES due to industry disapproval, veteran games journalist Arnie Katz argues that the industry needs a national electronic gaming convention where hardcore gamers can have a chance to meet developers and see the latest games.
What an ironic headline to have in light of recent events at the time of this recording.
I actually wrote this maybe 2 days before the E3 news broke. And again, for those in the future, just now in December 2023, we got the news that there will not be another E3. Here, 30 years ago, Arnie Katz is, and Arnie Katz, I mean, he's game journalist going back to the late 70s, practically. He is talking about we need this place where we can really feel this sense of community between developers and the gamers and the presentation of upcoming things to build hype, to build community, to get direct feedback from people, that this is good for the industry as a whole. He's arguing it as we need this forum. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not what E3 was in its earliest days, because the public element of it that Arnie Katz really wanted, E3 was just as disdainful of that as CES was, though, of course, E3 did finally begin letting the public in as their situation got more precarious. And they let the public in other ways, even before that, by streaming the press conferences and giving us such moments as Ridge Racer and My Body is Ready.
Yes. And it is kind of weird he's asking for this right before the event that's going to help create E3 is about to happen just a few months later. But yeah.
Absolutely.
So, at this point, it's hard to remember just how disconnected most gamers were from one another. I mean, you may have purchased a magazine, maybe you sent in a letter, but you couldn't really exchange your opinions of games with anybody but your closest friends.
Well, yeah, and the other thing too, I mean, those magazines, the Game Pros and Electronic Gaming Monthlies of the world, they basically printed news and rumors side by side and did not always distinguish between which one was which. So in terms of keeping up on what the publishers are doing as well, it was pretty darn opaque.
Very, very true. Although, from my point of view, it creates some very interesting news items that we can laugh at nowadays, looking back.
That's true. That's true. But there is one magazine that kind of stands above all of that petty fray and always has. In some ways, the magazine of record, if you were one of the more literate computer game fans out there. And this is, of course, Computer Gaming World. However, we get news this month that Ziff Davis has bought CGW.
Magazine publisher Ziff Davis, publishers of magazines such as PC Magazine, has purchased veteran games mag Computer Gaming World. Rumor has it Ziff Davis may request that they begin to review console games, although that is something that they experimented with last year briefly.
I just picture Computer Gaming World as, these stereotypical nobles, like, no, console games, we cannot touch console games. So very common, we review war games and adventure games here on the computer.
Let me put it this way. As we saw in our last episode, the October 83 jump, they were already snobby about the Commodore 64 back in 1983.
Yes.
Computer Gaming World, I have to admit, was a magazine that I never held in high regard because I considered most of their reviews to be, how can I say this?
They were the New Yorker of computer game magazines.
Yes, they were just as entertaining and informative because computer gaming is a purely non-visual medium. That's why there was virtually no screenshots of the game, so you didn't even know what it looked like. And you had to rely on, instead of one small screenshot, you had to wait for 3 pages of text describing the interface. You could have just shown me a picture. I would have known.
It doesn't matter what a game looks like, Carl. What matters is if they got the relative strength of a Sherman tank correct compared to a Panzer IV.
No, it mattered whether or not this wannabe writer got to write for 3 pages or not. I mean, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it had a different vibe, and you know, not to be too dismissive of that because it was a vibe that was very popular with its reader base, but it was definitely a different vibe from the other magazines of the time, even in the United States, to say nothing for the irreverence in the United Kingdom, where we get another new entrant this month as Edge #1 premieres.
British game mag Edge premieres this month. Its unique layout style, which would later be adopted by its American spin-off Next Generation, is already present in this very first issue, and its clean and informative writing leaves virtually every other mag on the planet in its dust. This first issue's cover is dedicated to 3DO, while it also features articles contrasting both Commodore and Atari's last Hail Marys at Relevance, the CD32 and Jaguar, the dawn of the Hollywood star showing up in FMV games, and so many other interesting trends.
Yeah, talk about, I mean, this is a good contrast here because talk about 2 magazines that could not be more different than CGW and Edge.
Yeah.
And spoiler alert, only one of those still publishes today.
Yeah, I mean, just reading it, already this first issue, with the nice white sidebars on the pages that are often filled with tiny little factoids that help flesh out the articles, the cynicism, but also the in-depth. I mean, the interview with Heinemann in this, where it's not just, what did you do on this game and how many more colors does this have than the other versions when talking about Out of This World, but literally talking about, what are the problems with the hardware? Would you buy this? They ask Heinemann directly, is it worth buying at $700? Do you think this machine will sell? Heinemann is there trying to promote this game that she just made, and they're getting these really honest answers out of her. And it's a different level of journalism. It's treating the people who make the games as human beings. It's trying to look through the hype. It's not there to sell advertising. There's so little advertising in this 116-page magazine that, I mean, it's all data.
And they've always been interested in the history of the industry as well. They often feature interviews with figures and ask them how they got in the game industry. Not from the very beginning, but later in time, they start having making of features in the magazine where they go over how classic games were made. It really feels like it's in touch with the industry in a different way than anything that's come before it. I mean, I'm a great fan of Edge as a publication. I think it's even today still the best argument for why, even in the age of the internet, it is still a good idea to have some print publications of record out there.
Oh, definitely. And even in this issue, in this article where they're contrasting the CD32 and the Jaguar, they have a sidebar talking about how basically both of the companies were at least co-founded by Trammell. They have a sideline talking about, the failure of the CD-TV. So we have the CD32 in context. And here, just as a side note, they mention that the current managing director of Commodore UK, David Pleasance, is the third managing director in a year of the company. They talk about the losses for the year of $273.6 million for Commodore in 1993, and that they closed 5 subsidiaries in that year. And David Pleasance's comment is, well, now it's great news. I love hearing this because it means that we're ready to take on the console industry.
Yes, because nothing says we're ready to enter the console industry than we have no cash reserves and huge losses.
Yeah, exactly. And by contrast, Atari has only lost $73 million in 1992. But, just these breakdown of numbers and stuff is something that you're not seeing in any of the other magazines on this scope. And it really just does feel like it's an adult magazine. You're reading something that's not targeting the kids. And the reviews are blatantly honest. Are you going to get your money's worth if you buy this? You don't have to agree with everything. They blast, what's the name of the game? That Genesis title, Gunstar Heroes. They blast that pretty badly by saying it's over too quickly, and but it's worth a read. And they even talk about in their top lists on selling games. They also have a sidebar talking about, here we're going to list 5 games that have never been beaten and are still great. And, they've got a whole bunch of older titles listed. They're already looking back at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really think that both Edge and its American spinoff Next Generation are probably fairly critical to the way the console industry grew and changed in that next generation, because they went hard, in depth on this is what Sega's offering, this is what Sony's offering, this is what Nintendo's offering, talking about chips, talking about capabilities and all of this stuff, and really educating the consumer to be ready for this transition to the next generation of more 3D focused consoles.
Oh, definitely. I was a loyal Next Generation reader all the way to the very bitter end. And those magazines, I kept them for so many years because they were great to go back to. If you wanted to look up the specs on something before, obviously, Wikipedia and so forth was there to keep that kind of data, they were invaluable. But
absolutely.
Oh, well.
And we'll end this section with Mario Teaches English?
Yes. German dictionary publisher Langenscheidt has released a German-English dictionary with a Mario license. Every few pages, characters from the Mario universe help readers with helpful tips and phrases in English.
I'm aware of most of the weird Mario spin-offs, like Teaches Typing and Is Missing, but I was not aware of this one. This is news to me.
This is coming from, this was announced in Power Play magazine, a German games mag, which was one that I actually bought back then, and I had this issue, and I did not remember this at all. And I looked it up. It's an actual thing. I found another reference to it, links in the show notes. And the really weird thing with this is the Mario character is not that well known yet in Germany. The Nintendo, especially the Super NES, is starting to pick up steam, especially a lot of people bought it for Mario Kart or Street Fighter 2. But the fact that Langenscheidt is bought the license or got the license and is publishing this really is showing the takeoff or how much power these consoles are beginning to have. Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
So it really is sort of that, I think, is the bigger takeaway here, that there's this product, and clearly Mario is now well known enough that somebody thinks that this is a good idea.
Yes, in that period when Nintendo was still a little loosey-goosey about Mario and let things like the Super Mario Brothers movie happen.
Oh, come on. That was pure success, right?
Yes. That is exactly what happened. Alrighty then, moving on. Speaking of adaptations of games into other media, Mortal Kombat goes multimedia.
Midway has signed a licensing deal with producer David Kasanoff and licensing firm The Licensing Group to bring Mortal Kombat to film, TV, and merchandise. With the massive success of Mortal Monday, the launch event for the home versions of Mortal Kombat having moved a reported 2.2 million game carts on a marketing budget of $7 million, with more sales yet to come, the potential for Mortal Kombat to become a cross-mass media darling isn't far-fetched, and is just in time as the Street Fighter movie is anticipated to hit theaters in the summer of 1994.
Now, I know that the Mortal Kombat movie was very successful and was considered the first kind of okay, we don't have to be completely embarrassed about it, video game movie. And I know the Street Fighter movie is not any of that, but damn it, Carl, I will take the Street Fighter movie with Raul Julia chewing the scenery while dying of
as someone who has not rewatched the Mortal Kombat movie since I saw it in theaters, and came out of the theater completely enthralled and loved it, because it felt like that action movie, and I'm sure it does not hold up. But I have watched the Street Fighter movie multiple times since it was originally released, and I completely agree with you that it has that campy charm that makes the Adam West Batman show infinitely rewatchable. And I think that in retrospect, that is probably the movie that survives better as a rewatch today. But the Mortal Kombat movie at the time, I don't know, did you see it in the theaters at the time?
No, I didn't, because I was always more of a Street Fighter than a Mortal Kombat person, so I wasn't that interested.
I was an equal Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat fan. And I can tell you the electricity coming out of that theater. And I had gone there with two friends of mine that I worked with at Funplex. And alone the opening scene when the techno remix of Mortal Kombat starts, we were in until the very last moment. I mean, until that last thing, and then when we see Shao Kahn at the end, and we're like, oh, hell yeah, bitch, let's bring it. It just was...
Well, yeah, brilliant. I mean... Yeah, no, absolutely. Because, I mean, you know, all kidding aside, I mean, it's the first time it felt like a video game movie was, A, not embarrassed to be a movie adapted from a video game, and B, not afraid to go all in on what people found enthralling about the video game itself. A very different approach than previous films adapted from or adapted around video games.
And this is really the big downside to the Street Fighter movie is it feels like it's embarrassed to be a Street Fighter movie. Like the entire premise of Street Fighter with the fighting championship is completely abandoned in the Street Fighter movie.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's like, you know, let's make a typical Jean-Claude Van Damme military action movie, a martial arts movie, but, you know, let's throw in some bison bucks and some green thing, you know? No, I agree. And so I do understand why this is significant, that the Mortal Kombat movie is way more of an important milestone than Street Fighter 2. It's just, or the Street Fighter movie. It's just, like I said, that campiness. And I mean, Raul Julia, come on.
Oh, that's true. He is amazing in that film.
And he did it while he was literally wasting away dying of cancer. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah. And
don't know how he did it.
Yeah, he holds through. Granted, it was a very, very short shoot. I mean, it was like a 2-week shoot or something. So,
well, of course, but I'm surprised he could last 2 minutes with how ill he was, and he does. I mean, I'm just saying.
Oh, consummate professional. Wow. I mean, the man was amazing in everything that he did. But
absolutely, still the best Gomez.
Oh yeah.
There will never be another Gomez.
The OG Gomez, the OG television Gomez was a very, very different portrayal of Gomez. A very, very different portrayal.
Ed Aston.
Yeah, Ed Aston.
Ed Aston, Sean Aston's father.
Yeah. I mean, he's a completely different character than Raul Julia's. But they're both excellent.
Absolutely. Well, I have to step away for a second. This is completely unplanned because I did not know this was happening, but I have to step away for a second to get a prop for this one.
Oh, no. A prop in an audio podcast that nobody can see. Yeah, this is good. Let's see, what's the prop? Oh, no.
Just for your benefit, obviously, because this is not video recorded. TSR brings video to board games.
Oh, he has the manual for it here.
It's the video. It's the video
set. Oh, even worse. So, TSR has announced Dragon Strike, a D&D inspired board game that uses live action footage to enhance the action through the magic of video cassette. So obviously you have the original cassette there.
Yeah.
Pray tell and explain to me, because while I have watched the video clips of this on YouTube, I still do not quite understand how the video interacts with the board game.
So it doesn't.
Okay. That's a good start.
That's why you don't understand it. No, it's the video is merely an introduction to the world. So like the video has it's not a VCR game where you play the video throughout the scenarios. Dragon Strike was seen as a way to kind of introduce D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, to AD&D at the time, I guess, to kind of a younger set that maybe wasn't ready to do the full-on role-playing thing. And so it was kind of, which is the reason me and my friends ended up getting it, is it was kind of similar to Hero Quest. If you're familiar with Hero Quest, the board game, except that it had slightly more RPG elements to it. It had outdoor areas as well as indoor. Obviously, it's just got one board, so there's not a lot of variety to the outdoor area. And there was this idea that you could like interact with NPCs, not just fight. It's a pretty basic kind of game. Not even as good as Hero Quest, and I don't think it ended up doing very well, but I ended up buying it. The video is terrible. And even at the time, you know, we knew it was terrible.
Yeah.
As young teens. I guess tweens. We were just before teenage years. So I don't even know why this is on my shelf. I mean, I wouldn't get rid of it, but I'm just saying I don't know why it ended up in a box of all of my books and stuff that have survived moves from place to place to place as opposed to being locked away in my parents' basement somewhere like most things of that vintage. I'm not holding on to it for any particular reason. I'm not holding on to this on my bookshelf out of nostalgia or like hipster irony. It's just kind of there. And I think that's how you can describe Dragon Strike in general. It's just kind of there.
Yeah. And I included it here because it just felt very much in the vein of the FMV multimedia.
Oh, Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. This was TSR's attempt to kind of reintroduce, D&D to a generation that grew up on video games. There had been, D&D starter sets and D&D board games even before D&D as opposed to AD&D. They've always kind of had that thing going on, and adding a videotape to it, I think, was a way to try to capture, that demographic. It didn't work. Turns out the correct answer was podcasting. That's right. The correct answer for getting the young people into D&D is podcasting.
They should have just brought back the cartoon. That's all I'm saying. And now we end as we often do on one of Carl's. I have to put this in because it hits me in the nostalgias, whether it's completely relevant to video game history or not. Matt Groening launches Bongo Comics. The Simpsons are coming to comics. Bongo would become one of the most successful indie comic brands ever, publishing a variety of books based on Groening's properties.
I know you were big in the webcomic scene, so I'm sure this must be something that was particularly dear to you at the time.
The Simpsons comics themselves, not. I never actually found them all that interesting, but the Futurama comics were absolutely brilliant. Mm-hmm. If you're a fan of Futurama, I cannot recommend the comic books highly enough. I started buying them with issue 1 in sometime early 2000s and bought them all the way through to the end of the line. They were bi-monthly, so there's not that many out there, but definitely if you loved Futurama, it's a wonderful follow-up. But the main reason I'm including it here, since this is still the period of the comic book boom, the weird collector mania, and the Simpsons video games are still a massive licensing bonanza going on. It felt like a weird little synergy just to see, where these cross-media platforms, cross-media properties are going, and which media is currently appealing to a very certain demographic, the video game demographic, if you will. And so I just thought it was an interesting little side note to show, hey, there are these other media formats that are vying for kids' attention at this point in time, that are not just limited to licensing to video games or normal media as we know it. The comic book thing is about to go bust. Which will also free up a whole bunch of money for video games. Once the comic book bust goes, where all these kids are dropping like $30-40 a week on new comic books that are supposedly going to be worth a lot later on, and that money's going to flow back into other things, among them video games. So it's just nice to see that there's something other than dudes with 12 packs that are poorly drawn eating up that money for a little while. Sorry.
Well said.
That's all I got.
Well said.
All I got. So,
and that's all we've got for the whole episode, Carl.
Oh my goodness, you mean it's already over? How did we get through it so quickly? Okay, you have one task left, Alex. No, wait. We do have the quote of the month. And
right. Our new feature.
And I wasn't even going to have one until I saw this quote. And I was like, you know what? I have to include this because not only did it... You know how sometimes in magazines there's going to be a reviewer in the magazine that you identify them, and this is something that the younger viewers probably not going to recognize. They're going to associate maybe with a YouTuber or something. But back in the day, when you read the magazines, you'd see either the name of a reviewer or in some magazines, UK magazines and the German magazines like to do this, put a photo or a drawn image of the reviewers on there, so you associated them with a very specific person. And
absolutely,
we mentioned earlier Power Play magazine. This became one of my go-to magazines. My years when I was living in Germany, and one of the reviewers in that magazine, whom I learned was basically always on my wavelength. If he liked the game, I was probably going to like the game. If he didn't like the game, I was probably not going to care for the game either. So the guy I'm talking about, his name is Michael Hengst. He actually still does a lot of podcasting nowadays. After being a reviewer, he would go on to actually work in the industry, on the industry side as a marketing guy. But he was also the guy who did the German translations of several LucasArts games, including Monkey Island 1 and 2. And so he could really, really be harsh on games, but at the same time, he could also overlook small design flaws if he could find the fun in a game. And Power Play magazine was a magazine that had a very interesting review system, because you would have the overall text of the magazine would give you the description of what's happening in the game, plus also a little bit of an opinion. The opinion value was actually based on the entire review staff would get together and decide on that. But then they'd still have an additional sidebar with the opinion of one main reviewer, which could differ dramatically from the overall score. So you might have one main reviewer who was like, this sucked, but the overall score was very good because everybody else in the office kind of liked it. And it gave everything sort of a little bit different feel. And this month, they are reviewing Super Mario Bros. All-Stars. And the general review in the office apparently is that Super Mario All-Stars is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Everybody else can't get enough of it, but there's one holdout. And that is my man, Michael Hengst. And let me just... the faces would also change based on what they thought of it. So here's one of the main reviewers going, super, this is great. It's everything you always wanted in a Mario game. Plus you're getting all the back games that were great. And you can play these forever. Everything's great. And here's Michael. And and he starts off by saying, lately I've been living very dangerously. While the rest of the editorial staff has this increasing excitement for the Super Nintendo rehash of oldie adventures of the fat little plumber Mario, I just keep looking. I'm trying to translate this in real time, and sentence structure is different in German and English, but I keep having to hold back a fit of screaming rage at the simple sight of red overalls. Because I just find this specialist in broken pipes, he can't understand what the fascination is with this guy who's good at broken pipes. Yeah. So he says the introduction of a new Mario title is always a good reason to abstain from the Super Nintendo. And he goes on to say that he doesn't understand what the marionettes, as he calls them, find interesting about this. The jump and run junkies, and having to memorize where all the hidden places are and so forth. He just doesn't understand where the excitement is.
He probably doesn't like kittens
no,
either.
No. He's he just does not get it. And I happen to agree with him. I know it's controversial. I never got the Mario games. I've tried, didn't get them. And so that's my quote of the month. Sort of long-winded. Should have prepared that better. Say the overall staff score was 94, but they had to put in the democratic response to the religious zealots. That yes, there's no. One of his big picks of this month was Stronghold, which he admits, there's some technical problems, but totally immersive and innovative, and you should definitely play it. So that's
your man Daglow's company, right?
Yeah, that was our man Daglow's company. Don made that. We talked about it quite extensively in my interview with him. Check that out. And this is why it's just brought back these memories, and I had completely forgotten that he had written that. Granted, I had not played a lot of Mario at that point. I didn't really try to get into Mario until later on because I didn't have access to it. It was just good to see that he was reasonable then. He's reasonable now. I love him on his podcast, so just wanted to throw that out there. And since we've had the quote of the month, the very last thing that we need to do, the word of the episode.
Well, this one was easy, unlike some months. Clearly, it is multimedia. From Apple creating multimedia computers that nobody knows why the heck they're doing it, to Mortal Kombat going from video games to movies and other forms of licensing, to all of the debate over what exactly the future of fancy computer graphics look like. Gosh, I sure hope it's Rise of the Robots. Multimedia definitely defined the outlook in October 1993.
And that seems like a perfectly fitting close to this episode. So, please remind the kind viewers where they can find your fine work.
Well, that would be theycreateworlds.com, where you can see the podcast. They Create Worlds, twice a month, every month without fail. Just celebrated our 200th episode, which dropped on December the 15th of 2023. And there's also information there about the book and all the other stuff that I may have going on from time to time as well.
Excellent. Links in the show notes below, as well as to all the sources. And everybody else, remember, if you like what we're doing here, just $1 a month as a sign of appreciation gets you into our Patreon, and you get to also watch Alex's attempts at playing Hired Guns, as well as all the other 7 Minutes in Heaven videos. I believe we're up to close to 60 of them now in the repertoire, as well as early access to the interview episodes. And with that being said, it's very, very late. It's time for Carl to go to bed and have fun.